I returned home. My hometown greeted me like an old acquaintance, with a faint taste of nostalgia and predictable comfort. It was a place where everything remained the same, yet I felt like a stranger in my own memories. Many years had passed since I left. The noisy metropolis overshadowed my thoughts of quiet streets and peeling houses where I once played as a child. My sister's house, a two-story building with a worn facade and windows that hadn't seen a good cleaning in years, looked just as I remembered it. It seemed like nothing had changed here. Even the old potted plants stood on the porch, waiting for my visits that never came. But inside, everything was different. I had changed. A light unease, unfamiliar to me before, crept into my mind. I stood on the doorstep, feeling as though time was compressing the space between the past and the present. I was waiting for my sister, but instead, her son, Mike, opened the door. He had once been just a boy I'd patted on the head, telling him that one day he would grow up. But here he was, standing before me, already an adult, with a confident smile and eyes full of assurance. He was no longer the awkward teenage shadow I remembered. He was someone else, and that realization immediately stirred a strange, unfamiliar feeling within me. "You've come." His voice was so firm that I felt something inside me tense up. I tried to smile in response, but the words got stuck in my throat. Mike explained that his mother couldn't make it and that he would help me prepare for the weekend. He was an adult now, and I felt that everything in this house, in this city, even I, had turned into something entirely new and unknown. I stood before him, trying to find that girl from the past that I once knew. But just like the city, I understood that she was no longer there. "You've come," Mike said, and his voice sounded firm and confident, as though he were the one in charge of the house, not me, as I had expected. This made me pause for a moment. He was different. Not the boy I remembered, with messy hair and a shy, childlike demeanor, but a grown man with whom it seemed I lacked a common language. I tried to smile, but it came out forced. I had thought that I would return here, and everything would be as it was before. That by meeting my sister, I would find myself back in the familiar world full of her cares and childhood memories. But I hadn't expected to meet Mike like this. He told me that his mother couldn't make it, and that he would help me get ready for my stay. I nodded, not knowing what to say. A strange feeling filled my head. It seemed as though nothing had changed. The old walls, the familiar smell of wood, even the same old couch that had been here in my youth. But with him, with Mike, something was off. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly, but his gaze, the way he spoke, his confidence, none of it matched the image of the boy I once walked these streets with. Mike suggested I come inside. I took a step, and a light shiver ran through my body. I didn't know where it came from, but I felt uneasy. He was an adult now, and I, it seemed, had stayed in the past. When we entered the house, everything seemed the same, but completely different. I felt how it had changed, how time had become an invisible barrier between us. We moved into the living room, and Mike started doing something with the fireplace while I stood and watched him. His movements were confident, and I couldn't understand why it unsettled me. Once I had seen him as my sister's younger brother, but now I didn't know what was happening with him. And maybe something was happening with me too, but I didn't want to think about it. "It'll be fine," he said, returning to the fireplace. "I'm sure you'll like it here. We'll make this house cozy, just like before." I nodded, but his words didn't bring me any relief. On the contrary, I felt as though my thoughts were stuck in a mental block, as if everything that was happening wasn't mine, wasn't my life, but someone else's. Not my place, not my home. We started talking about simple things. How long it had been since we'd seen each other, what had changed in the city. He spoke with that same unflappable calm that his mother once had, but with her, it always seemed warm and reassuring. And now? Now I couldn't shake the feeling that every glance of his was a question I couldn't understand, couldn't answer. I tried not to think about it, but his confidence and adulthood seemed to tighten around me in a way I couldn't decipher. Everything was just as I remembered. The same smell, absorbed into the old wooden floors, slightly musty but familiar. The living room still had the same furniture, the old, slightly squeaky sofa that had never really been comfortable, and the crystal chandelier in the corner covered in the dust of years with fabric that hadn't been wiped in ages. The paintings on the walls still hung on the same nails, long faded and slightly dried out. I stood in this familiar, well-known space, but suddenly I felt it had become foreign. Everything was as it had been, yet I sensed that at some point this house had stopped being mine. Mike silently began to light the fireplace. He carefully arranged the logs, placing them in the center, and I noticed how his hands, so sure, had become stronger than before. It seemed that in his calm actions there was some meaning I couldn't grasp. I watched him, and the inner unease wouldn't leave me. Everything was so familiar, yet perhaps that was the main change. In the house, in Mike, in my own feelings. I sat on the sofa, trying not to think about how his presence disrupted my familiar world. Sitting there, I felt a strange pressure. His movements, his gaze, everything seemed so natural, so confident, and yet it left me feeling disoriented. Mike returned to the fireplace, and the fire finally began to grow. The warmth from the flames spread through the room, but I continued to sit, absorbed in my unease. Why had I come back here? What was I waiting for? These thoughts buzzed in my mind, refusing to let me find peace. "It'll be fine," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "We'll make this place cozy, just like before." I didn't answer, just nodded. Why would I need comfort if I felt like a stranger in this house? Why couldn't I relax when everything should have been just as it was before? Why did every word he spoke, every glance, make me feel trapped? I tried to focus on his actions, on how he leaned over the fire, adjusting the logs. But as soon as I caught his gaze again, I felt overwhelmed. There was something different in it. I couldn't explain it exactly. It wasn't anxiety. It was something more. An inexpressible yet clear feeling that everything around me had stopped being as it was. We talked a little, but the conversation felt hollow. "I spoke about something trivial," he responded, but there was an invisible wall between us. I couldn't focus on the words because they lost their meaning in the tension, in the feeling that everything I knew, everything I had seen, had suddenly become different. Morning. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of hot coffee in my hands, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. Outside the window, it was quiet. The city was waking up but wasn't yet ready to show its usual bustle. Everything was wrapped in a light mist, which mesmerized with its silence, making the world seem not as usual, not as familiar. There was something special in this morning calm, yet something unsettling as well. Mike came out onto the terrace with his own cup of coffee. He stood by the balustrade as though enjoying the moment of silence. I knew I should say something, start a conversation. But I didn't want to break this fragile world, which, as I felt, could collapse at any moment. Instead, I invited him to join me. He came over and sat beside me, but we remained silent. We both looked at the mist, the lifeless gray buildings, and the dew-soaked trees, probably trying to make sense of what was happening around us. I was trying to warm myself, not just from the cold, but also from the feelings that had been with me since the morning. In this silence, amid everything that seemed familiar, there was a sense of dissatisfaction that wouldn't let go. I couldn't understand what it was. An unclear anxiety that hung in the air between us. This feeling wasn't new. I had felt it for a long time, but now it was much more apparent. Louder, as though it was ready to break free. Something was wrong, and I couldn't figure out what exactly. Mike sighed and took a sip of his coffee, glancing at me. His gaze was calm, but something about it made me uneasy. I felt his calmness pressing down on me, making me even more alert. "It's beautiful here," he said, raising an eyebrow slightly. It was a simple observation, but in his tone there was something ironic, as if he knew something more. I just nodded in response, not knowing what else to say. In that moment, every word seemed unnecessary. Silence filled the space again. I didn't try to break it because I felt that any attempt to speak would only pull me away from what was important. But what was important? And why, in this house, among these familiar walls, did I feel like I didn't belong? We sat in silence, absorbing the moment, but in the air, there lingered a feeling that I couldn't ignore. It wouldn't let me find peace and wouldn't allow me to relax. Something was inevitably changing, and I couldn't understand where it would lead. The same day that the sun's rays began to break through the clouds, I suggested to Mike that we take a walk in the park. The park was close by, just a few minutes' walk, and I had always loved walking there when I was younger. It was just as I remembered it. Old trees, low benches covered in moss, and paths that led along a small pond. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, leaving people alone with their thoughts. Mike agreed without asking any unnecessary questions. We walked in silence, his steps confident, mine heavier, as though I were dragging some invisible burden behind me. I looked around at the familiar paths, listened to the rustling of autumn leaves underfoot, and thought about how little had changed in this park. Everything was in its place. The same old trees under which Mike and I once sat, and the same swings I remembered from childhood. But now everything looked different. The childlike joy, that sense of carefree freedom, was gone. Everything felt heavy, like autumn rain. I noticed how his gaze occasionally lingered on me. It wasn't a casual glance, as it usually is between people who haven't seen each other for a long time. It was a gaze that stayed, studied, waiting. I felt my steps start to tighten, as if the air around us had become dense. Everything seemed familiar. We were walking in the park, walking along the path, but his gaze, which I caught, made me slow my pace. He didn't say a word, but I could feel his eyes sliding over me, as if he wanted to understand something, to solve something. Perhaps I wanted that too, but I didn't know how to achieve it. I couldn't stop thinking that something had changed between us, that this moment was some kind of turning point. When I accidentally caught his gaze again, I felt something inside me tense, as if we were both standing on the edge of an abyss, and I didn't know whether I would jump or stay in place. He didn't look away, and in that silence, in that gaze, there was something dangerous, as if some new boundary had appeared between us, one I couldn't understand. I didn't know what to do with this feeling, but it was so strong that I couldn't ignore it. It didn't let go, like a heavy stone on my soul. We continued walking, but it became difficult for me. It was as if I were walking, but something invisible was pulling me back. I couldn't understand what was happening, why I felt as though this world, this park, this day, this whole walk wasn't what it was supposed to be. When we returned home, everything felt strange. We had been silent the whole way back, and the silence that I had tried to mask with simple words now felt especially heavy. I couldn't shake the thought that something had happened. Nothing obvious, nothing specific, but the feeling that something inexplicable had disrupted the usual rhythm. In my head, there was a tangled mess of thoughts that refused to come together. Mike continued to stay close, his calmness almost tangible, but now it seemed to press down on me. I tried to return to reality, but I couldn't shake the feeling that all the events of the day were slipping past me like raindrops on glass. I looked at Mike, at his face, at his confidence, and couldn't understand what he was looking for in this silence. Why wouldn't he look away? Why did I feel so uncomfortable? The house was filled with a strange silence that seemed to occupy every corner. We were rearranging things, taking turns moving furniture and putting everything back in its place. But every movement I made felt forced, as if I were doing all of this to avoid feeling how deeply his words and his gaze had affected me. We didn't discuss anything, and even the simplest actions, boiling the kettle or wiping dust from a shelf, felt unusual. Not like before. I tried to act naturally because I didn't know how else to behave, and each time I caught his gaze, I felt the weight of it. He looked at me with such calmness that it felt absurd. Where was the Mike I remembered? Where was the boy I used to walk through this house with, leaving footprints on the carpet, playing board games? Where was the Mike I could talk to about anything without overthinking or worrying about my words? Are you okay? His voice broke the silence, and I immediately felt the tension in the air increase. I was unbearably ashamed. Why was it so hard for me? Why couldn't I go back to what was? I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know what to answer. I couldn't understand what was happening, why this day, this return home, felt so foreign. Why had Mike become a part of this rift that I felt between myself and the world? Yes, I said, trying to hide my confusion, but his gaze told me that he didn't believe me. And that was the worst part. We were silent. I sank back into the heavy quiet, not knowing how to escape it. When dinner time came, I felt like a stranger in this house that had once been full of family warmth and conversation. Mike and I sat at the table, and I noticed how even the simplest words had become heavy. Everything felt forced. I tried to speak, but my words sounded strained, as if each one was unnecessary. Why was I saying anything? For whom? For what? Mike seemed calm, but in his gaze I caught again that same weight I couldn't understand. He put his spoon down several times as though trying to gather his thoughts, but he couldn't find the right words. The silence between us was like something impenetrable, like an invisible wall I couldn't deal with. I tried to smile, picking at the dishes he had made. They were tasty, simple, but every bite of food brought no pleasure. With each new bite, I felt my anxiety grow. It seemed like my thoughts were scattering and my emotions were overwhelming me, but I couldn't express them. I couldn't tell Mike that everything that had happened felt like too much of a shock to me. Have you ever thought about what you want? He suddenly asked, breaking the silence. The question hung in the air between us, like thunder that you hear but can't figure out where it came from. I felt my breath catch. He was looking at me as if he expected an answer, but I couldn't respond. I didn't know what I wanted. What do you mean? I tried to steer the conversation back to something familiar, but my voice already carried a trace of nervousness. I wasn't ready for questions like this. It felt too deep, too personal. Mike pushed his plate away and looked at me, his eyes searching for something I couldn't give. I felt his gaze move over me and I shrank inside. Every word he said, every silence between us seemed so powerful and heavy that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in some way. But it was a trap I couldn't even understand. I fell silent, poking at my plate with my spoon. His words, his gaze kept spinning in my mind. I didn't know what to say. Everything felt so hard, so unexpected. Mike, once a teenager, now a man asking me questions I had been avoiding my whole life. We sank back into silence, and I felt everything around us become sharper. This wasn't a regular dinner. This wasn't just a meeting with a close person. This was something more. An internal challenge that I wasn't ready to face. The next morning, after a night filled with restless thoughts and confusion, Mike decided it was time to talk. The morning was the same as every other morning in this house. The sunlight barely broke through the windows, not disturbing the silence. I sat at the table holding a cup of coffee, trying to regain some semblance of normality. But it was clear that something was wrong with this morning, just as with everything that had been happening. I constantly felt on the edge of something new, unfamiliar, and perhaps a little frightening. Mike sat across from me, silent as always, but his gaze was different now. He didn't look away, like he had yesterday. He continued to look at me, and I felt the tension building. "You've been avoiding me," he suddenly said calmly, but with a clear pain in his voice. He wasn't asking a question, but making a statement. "I feel like you can't be yourself around me. Something happened, and I can't understand what it is." I flinched at his words, but didn't respond immediately. His gaze was persistent, and there was a kind of determination in it that I couldn't ignore. It was like I was under scrutiny, unsure of how to react. What happened? Why was it so hard to talk? Why did his presence make me feel so alien? I don't know what's happening between us. I finally exhaled. The words felt hard, as if every sound I made was a stone I was pulling from my heart. I didn't know why I felt this way. I didn't know what this feeling was that wouldn't let me go. Mike leaned forward slightly, his eyes softer but no less perceptive. He was waiting for me to continue. I tried to gather my thoughts, but they scattered. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. "Have you ever thought about what you really want?" he asked again, but now it sounded less like a question and more like a challenge. There was a certain insistence in his words, something that urged me to think deeply. What did I really want? I didn't know. I had never thought about it before. His question struck me at my core. I tried to avoid it, tried to continue living along the well-worn path without asking myself such deep questions. But now, they were like sharp needles, piercing through me. I couldn't ignore them any longer. I fell silent, not knowing how to respond. We sat like that for a while, and the only sound in the silence was the soft clink of spoons and cups. But in this silence, I felt something inside me begin to stir, as if I was waking from a long sleep. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice quiet and unsure. I haven't thought about it. I think I've forgotten what I want. I've lived how I was expected to, how it was supposed to be. And now I don't know." Mike listened to me quietly, but in his eyes I saw relief. He didn't rush to respond, didn't try to comfort me. He was just there, listening, and his silence was much louder than any words. I felt something shift within me. This was the first step toward figuring out what was happening in my life, what I was truly feeling. With each of his questions, with each of his looks, I began to understand that something had to change. But what? And how? The day passed in contemplation. We didn't talk as much as the day before, but the questions Mike had asked stayed with me. I tried to focus on the daily tasks, helping him clean, dealing with small household chores, but in my mind, his words kept swirling. "Have you ever thought about what you really want?" They echoed inside me, like the tolling of bells in the silence. And I couldn't find an answer to them. What do I really want? This question was simple and yet incredibly complex. I had told myself many times that I was living the way I should. First school, then work, then work, more work. And all these years, I thought that following the beaten path was enough for happiness. But now, when Mike asked that question, I felt that this certainty was crumbling. I couldn't even tell myself what I truly wanted. Maybe I had never thought about it. The past returned to me like rain that suddenly starts when you're not ready for it. Memories, long forgotten, now resurfaced, disturbing my thoughts. I remembered how, in my youth, I dreamed of becoming an artist. How I had plans and dreams of traveling, of meeting new people. But what had happened to those dreams? Why had I given up on them? Why had it been so easy to forget what I really wanted? And then, his face appeared again. Mike. His questions. His calmness. It was as if he was pushing me to look at my life from a different perspective. I felt how it began to dismantle the usual calmness on which I had always built my life. I watched him that day. He was, as always, confident, calm, but now, as I tried to understand what was happening, I noticed how his eyes sometimes lingered on me. It wasn't childish or restrained, but a deep adult look. And in that gaze, there was something I couldn't understand, but I felt it was important. It was as if he saw what I myself didn't want to see. Time passed, but the internal chaos didn't leave me. The questions he had asked became inevitable. I couldn't ignore them. And I couldn't understand why I was so afraid to face the answers. I knew that behind these questions was something more. Maybe it was something I wasn't ready to accept. Maybe that was why I had been avoiding these questions all along. But now, I couldn't stop. Mike didn't know what was going on in my head. He was just waiting. His silence wasn't pressure. It was an invitation, open and honest. And that perhaps was the hardest part. to realize that I had to find the answers myself, but didn't know how. Morning came faster than I expected. When I woke up, it was quiet, and I immediately felt that something had changed. The house was filled with an odd silence. I got up, dressed, and went to the kitchen. And then I noticed that Mike was packing his things. It was a moment I hadn't fully realized until it became a reality. He was getting ready to leave. We hardly spoke during this early hour, although I tried to find the words to express everything I felt. But the words wouldn't come, as if they had been stolen by the silence that surrounded us. I sat at the table watching as Mike packed his things into a suitcase, neatly folding everything that remained of his stay here. It was hard for me to understand why this moment felt so heavy. He was simply leaving, but it seemed like I was losing something bigger than just a guest. "I need to leave," he said when he finished packing his things. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that I couldn't quite understand. I wanted to say something, but again I felt the words stuck in my throat. We were silent, and that silence felt final, as if words no longer mattered. I didn't know how to respond. What could I say at a moment when everything between us now seemed so unclear, so undefined? I felt an emptiness growing in my chest because, despite everything that had happened, I knew his departure would leave behind an invisible void. "You deserve to be happy," he said, and those words unexpectedly shattered everything I had been trying to keep inside. They were simple, but so heavy. He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes something that made me feel as if I were standing before someone who finally understood me, but couldn't help me. Those words stayed with me even after he was gone. Mike left, and the door closed behind him. In that moment, I felt everything around me slow down, as if the world had stopped moving, and I was left alone with my thoughts and with what had been said. He was gone, and I was left surrounded by all the memories, all the questions he had asked, and all the feelings I couldn't understand. I was alone, but in this solitude, there was something important. And maybe this was the moment I realized that I couldn't continue living the way I had before. Mike had become the person who opened my eyes to what I had been ignoring in myself. And even though I didn't know how to move forward, I understood that I was now at the beginning of a new phase. I had to start searching for answers. I had to start finding myself. After Mike left, the house became empty. Empty not just in a physical sense, but everything around me felt cold and uninviting, as if his presence had left an invisible mark. He had gone, but his words continued to echo in my head. "You deserve to be happy." These words wouldn't leave my mind, as if they held the key to what I had been searching for so long but was too afraid to admit to myself. I was left alone with the thoughts I had been trying to suppress all this time. I sat in the old chair in the same spot where Mike and I had often talked, and tried to understand what would come next. Everything around me was familiar, yet I felt something inside me had changed. I could no longer continue living in this familiar rhythm, with blocked feelings and unfinished dreams. I longed for something more, something I had long forgotten. Memories of childhood, of dreams that had once been so important, now came rushing back with new strength. I remembered how I wanted to learn to paint, how I planned trips, how I dreamed of a life where there was room not just for duties, but also for joy, sincere passions, and real emotions. I laughed when I thought about how long I had hidden these dreams from myself. I had gotten used to being good, a good daughter, a good worker, a good sister. But who was I to myself? I didn't need to find answers to all the questions right away. I realized I could move forward, despite the fear and doubt, because I was finally beginning to understand what was important. I deserve happiness. Happiness that didn't depend on anyone else's expectations or concerns. Happiness that I had to find within myself. And even though the path was still unclear, and there was so much unknown ahead, I felt that I could once again be honest with myself. I decided to start small. I would buy brushes and paints that I had put off for so long, and I would paint just as I had once dreamed. I would do what brought me joy, not just what I had to do. I would start traveling, seeking new places where I could feel alive. not just existing. I would open up new horizons, and even if the process was long and not always easy, I would keep moving forward. Mike had left, and with his departure, I was freed. He had become the person who helped me see that I could be more than just the role others had given me. He didn't provide me with ready answers, but his words and his gaze allowed me to take the first step toward a new life. And perhaps this was the beginning of what I had always been searching for, a path I could walk with an open heart and honesty to eventually find my true happiness.